What's up, team? Let's talk about minimum effective dose training, or the minimum amount of training that I can do in the gym while still being quite productive. How can I build strength and muscle while spending as little time in the gym as possible? Hopefully you're asking this question not because you're lazy, but because truly you need to manage a busy schedule, or you're managing your training time between resistance training and something like endurance training, which requires you to be really savvy with the amount of time you spend in the gym. Luckily for us, there's a fair bit of literature on the subject, and what I want to do is digest the research I've been doing on the topic so that you can find your sweet spot between optimal training dose and minimum effective dose. Now let's jump right into it and first talk about what would describe an optimal training session. So doing everything right to get the most amount of results possible. We're first going to have to look at it from the perspective of how much do I need to be doing and how hard does it have to be. And we're going to break that both down for building muscle as well as building strength. And when it comes to hypertrophy or the act of building muscle, what you want to look at is the total number of sets that you do in a week. Anywhere between 12 and 20 sets per muscle group per week is said to be the optimal amount of training volume for muscle growth. Now, when it comes to strength training, it's a little bit different. You don't need to do as much volume to get some serious strength adaptation. Typically, we're going to say somewhere between or somewhere around 8+ sets per week per muscle or per movement pattern. And now that we've established how much you need to be doing, it's really important to understand how hard every individual set needs to be to maximize either building muscle or strength. When it comes to building muscle, what's important to understand in a set is how close you get that set from failure or your proximity to failure. There's a concept that we call effective reps, which essentially states that the closer you take your set to momentary failure, which is the point where you are unable to keep performing repetition and therefore you fail, then the more effective or stimulative that set is going to be for building muscle. Every rep that brings you closer to failure is more productive than the previous one. Take the example of a set of 10 repetition on the bench press, where rep number 10 is the last rep you're able to complete at that weight. Now, the first rep that you're going to be doing is not going to do much when it comes to building muscle. Once you get to rep number 5, then 6, 7, the more you go towards 8, 9, then the more powerful at building muscle these reps are going to be. Now, on the flip side, when you get all the way up to 10, those repetitions are also a lot more difficult to recover from. So we typically say that the sweet spot for building muscle is going to be anywhere between 1 to 3 reps in reserve from failure. Now, I'm going to go deeper into this concept in another video where we're going to break this down into more details. But the point is, make sure your sets are difficult, not necessarily quite all the way up to failure, but close to it. And that should be hard enough to build muscle. Now, when it comes to building strength, the idea is a little bit different, where what you need to do is lift heavy enough so that the reps are stimulative at building or improving strength. Now, how heavy is heavy enough? Now we have to relate that to your 1 rep max. So your 1 rep max or your 1 repetition maximum is the maximum amount of weight that you can lift for 1 rep. Now, before we were talking about bringing a set to failure at 10 reps. Now we're talking about literally the heaviest load that you can lift for 1 repetition. You can't do more load and you can't do that weight for 2 reps. That's your 1 rep max. And as a percentage of your 1 RM, 80+% is said to be the sweet spot when it comes to improving strength, which you can imagine means that you're going to have to perform sets that are going to be on the lower end of the rep range, somewhere between 1 and 5, maybe 6 repetitions, so that you can be in that 80% plus rep range to build strength. Now, if you want to compare that to hypertrophy, you could get similar gains in terms of muscle doing sets of 6 repetitions all the way up to 30, 40 repetitions, assuming that you keep them at that same proximity to failure that we were talking about before. So optimal training program, somewhere between 12 and 20 sets brought close to failure per muscle group per week. Building strength is going to be more about lifting 8, maybe plus sets above 80% of your 1 rep max, sets of 1 to 5 reps on a weekly basis. Obviously, there's a little bit more to an optimal training program than how much and how heavy. That being said, this paints a pretty good picture when it comes to the conversation about optimal training program relative to minimum effective dose. Now that we've established what's optimal, let's talk about the minimum effective dose using the same language we were just discussing. Now, this paper you see on screen essentially shows us that anywhere, when it comes to hypertrophy, anywhere above 4 sets, if assuming they're taking close to failure, is going to give you a fair bit of the gains when it's likely 55% of the optimal training dose for what may be 2-3 times less training volume. Now, it's a big trade-off, I understand, but in my opinion, 55% of the gains for this few sets per week is a very interesting idea, especially if we're thinking about people like endurance athlete or hybrid athletes that need to control for the total amount of time that they spend in the gym. Now, 4 sets is the bare minimum. In my opinion, I'd give myself a little bit of buffer to make sure that I'm actually hitting a good sweet spot when it comes to minimum effective dose. I'm thinking you add 1 or 2 sets to that, call it 5 to 6 sets, and you're probably guaranteed to hit that 55% of the gains that we were just talking about. Now, if you do 6 sets per muscle group per week, we're talking about 2 training sessions of 3 sets per exercise, which is quite reasonable and doesn't take that much time. So that could be a very good starting point. Now, if we go back to our review from Iverson and colleagues, they pretty much show that you're going to get some strength adaptation from even doing 1 tough set per week. That being said, they also mention that as soon as you go to 2 to 3 sets, you're making 50% more gains when it comes to strength. So obviously, if you're super tight on time, any amount of strength training is going to work. If we circle back to our conversation about how hard, we've already discussed the importance of proximity to failure for building muscle and the importance of lifting above 80% when it comes to increasing strength. So those principles are going to still apply when it comes to minimum effective dose. And most likely, we could argue that if you're doing less work, then that work is probably going to have to be a little bit more challenging if you really want to maximize the results you're getting from that limited amount of volume. And follow the guidelines that we just discussed in the minimum effective dose segment. Now, if you're looking to save as much time as possible, you're likely going to want to choose compound exercises or multi-joint exercises because they're going to allow you to target more than one muscle group at a time during a specific set. If you take the example of a leg extension machine isolating exclusively the quads, and you compare that to a back squat where you're going to get a good amount of work on your quads, also your low back, maybe your core, also particularly on your glutes and your adductors if you go all the way down to the bottom. Hitting this many muscle groups per set is going to be key if you're looking to maximize the time that you have in the gym. Now, let's say we stick to the 6 to 12 rep range for this practical example. This number of reps is enough to get some form of gain in strength. More importantly, some solid gains in terms of muscle if we bring the sets to failure. And it's also practical in terms of the number of reps not taking that long to complete if we compare it to, say, a set of 20 plus repetition. So we could have a couple compound exercises done in the 6 to 12 rep range for 3 sets twice per week, either the same exercise on both days for the same muscle groups, or we would create variety on the separate training days. But one of them could look like this. First exercise targeting the lower body, more in a pushing pattern. We could use the back squat as an example again. Then we would have to choose an exercise that would be pushing or pressing for the upper body as the dumbbell bench press. Now, if we really want to round out all the different muscle groups of the lower body, we would need an exercise specific to the posterior chain or the hamstring, as they're not targeted as much in a squat. So we'd have something like a Romanian deadlift. And then the flip side of a pressing exercise for the upper body would be an upper body pulling exercise, like a strict pull-up as an example. Again, taking close to failure in the 6 to 12 rep range for 3 sets. Call it 2 minutes of rest between exercises. You could probably go even a little bit less and still get some good benefits while still being able to load it. And this way, with these 4 exercises, we would have an example of a minimum effective dose workout. Now, you'd have to double this up to get your total weekly training volume of 6 sets. And from there, I have a working framework. If ever I have more time to train, then I can round out my workout with some isolation exercises, targeting specific muscle groups that are less emphasized in my previous example. As an example, your core, maybe putting a little bit more work on your biceps and triceps, or maybe putting more emphasis on a specific muscle group that is lagging in terms of strength or hypertrophy that you need to emphasize more, like a second lower body pushing exercise if you really need to build up your quads. But when now you have the two extremes, the optimal amount of training volume and the minimum effective dose, then it becomes a case by case of how much time can you afford to be in the gym. Maybe you can do a little bit more than our minimum example of 6 sets, and you can do 8 or 9 sets on most of your week, which is going to give you more of the results. Or maybe you have some weeks where you're extremely busy and only have time to make it for one session, but then you can adjust based on your current situation. But there you have it, a summary of what I think are the most important points when it comes to minimum effective dose training. I hope you enjoyed me breaking down the research that I've been doing on the topic recently. All of the stuff that I referenced in the video are going to be put down in the description if you want to do a little bit more research yourself. But if you have any questions around some of the concept we discussed in the video, don't be shy to reach out in the comments. If you want information on how to build a running program, if you want to start running in 2024, here's a video I recorded a couple of weeks ago on that. The combination of the two videos would give you enough info to have a solid hybrid training program where you know exactly how to approach your resistance training program as well as your endurance training program. Again, hope the info is useful. Catch you all in the next one, team.